How Apple nearly went bankrupt, then became the most valuable company on Earth. In the summer of 1997, Apple Computer had roughly 90 days of cash left. The company that had launched the personal computer revolution was weeks away from shutting down permanently. Its stock had fallen from $70 to under $4. Microsoft had just crushed it in the operating system wars. Apple's board was in chaos. Two different CEOs had come and gone in 3 years. And then Steve Jobs walked back through the door. What followed is the greatest corporate comeback in business history. Not a slow turnaround, a complete resurrection. Within 3 years, Apple was profitable again. Within 5 years, it had launched the iPod and redefined the music industry. Within 10 years, it had launched the iPhone and redefined civilization. And by 2022, Apple had crossed $2 trillion in market capitalization, a number so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. Today we're going to walk through the full story, the fall, the comeback, the product launches that changed everything, and the 5 ruthless business decisions that took Apple from near bankruptcy to the most valuable company in the history of human commerce. Stay with me, because the real lessons here have nothing to do with technology. They're about strategy, focus, and what happens when you strip everything down to what actually matters. Part 1. The Fall. To understand how far Apple fell, you need to understand how high it had already been. Apple Computer was founded on April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day, by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a third co-founder named Ronald Wayne, who famously sold his 10% stake for $800 11 days later. That stake would eventually be worth over $300 billion, but that's a story for another day. The company launched the Apple II in 1977, and it was a genuine revolution. For the first time, ordinary people could buy a personal computer that came in a case, had a keyboard, and worked out of the box. The Apple II minted Apple as a serious company and made Jobs and Wozniak millionaires in their 20s. Then came the Macintosh in 1984, introduced with one of the most famous commercials in television history, a dystopian Super Bowl ad directed by Ridley Scott. The Mac introduced the world to graphical user interfaces, the mouse, and the idea that computers could be beautiful. It was a cultural moment as much as a product launch. But behind the scenes, Apple was already tearing itself apart. Steve Jobs was a visionary, but he was also, by most accounts, extraordinarily difficult to work with. He clashed with the board of directors and with John Sculley, the CEO he himself had recruited from Pepsi. In 1985, the Apple board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was stripped of his responsibilities and forced out of the company he had co-founded. Jobs left and started a new company called Next. Apple continued without him, and slowly, then catastrophically, began to fall apart. Here's what happened over the next 12 years. Microsoft shipped Windows 95, which finally gave PC users a graphical interface. Suddenly, the main thing that made Mac special wasn't special anymore, and Windows ran on cheap commodity hardware that Apple couldn't compete with on price. Apple's market share collapsed from about 16% in the late 1980s to under 4% by 1997. The company burned through 3 CEOs. It launched product after product that failed. The Newton PDA, the Copeland operating system that was years late and eventually canceled, a line of computers so confusing that even Apple's own employees couldn't explain the difference between models. By 1996, Apple was losing $1 billion per year.
The board was desperate. They needed a new operating system, and they needed it fast. They looked at 2 options: buy B Incorporated, a Silicon Valley startup, or buy Next, the company Steve Jobs had built after leaving Apple. In December 1996, they chose Next. The price was $429 million. Steve Jobs came with the deal. Part 2. The Return. When Jobs came back to Apple in 1997, he was not immediately made CEO. He was called an advisor. But within months, it became clear that Jobs was running the show and that he was about to do something radical. The first thing he did was make a deal that shocked the entire technology industry. On August 6, 1997, at the Macworld Expo in Boston, a face appeared on the giant screen behind Steve Jobs via satellite. The audience booed. It was Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, Apple's archenemy, the man whose Windows had nearly destroyed Apple. Jobs had just announced a deal. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to making Microsoft Office for Mac for the next 5 years. Jobs' message to the audience was blunt. He said, quote, "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." End quote. It was a strategic masterstroke. Apple got cash and a commitment to software. Microsoft got to avoid an antitrust monopoly argument, and Jobs got the breathing room he needed to do what he actually came back to do. The second thing Jobs did was kill products. He walked into Apple and found a company selling dozens of computer models in a confusing matrix that made no sense. He canceled almost all of them. He reduced Apple's product line to 4 products. A desktop for consumers, a laptop for consumers, a desktop for professionals, and a laptop for professionals. That was it. 4 products. The rest were gone. His reasoning was simple. If Apple couldn't make the best computer in each category, it shouldn't make computers in that category at all. Focus is not about choosing what to do. Focus is about choosing what not to do. And Jobs was ruthless about it. By 1998, Apple shipped the iMac, a colorful, teardrop-shaped all-in-one computer that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. It came in Bondi blue, then grape, then tangerine. It sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. Apple was profitable again. But Jobs wasn't done, not even close. Part 3. The iPod and the Pivot. In 2001, Jobs made a bet that most people in the tech industry thought was bizarre. He looked at the music industry, which was being torn apart by Napster and illegal file sharing, and he saw an opportunity. His insight was this: people weren't stealing music because they wanted to be criminals. They were stealing music because the legal alternative was terrible. You had to buy a $17 CD to get the 2 songs you actually wanted. The music industry had failed to adapt, and consumers had gone around them. Jobs proposed something radical. Charge 99 cents per song. Let people buy just what they want. Make it legal, easy, and beautiful. And build a device to play it. The iPod launched on October 23, 2001, with the tagline that became famous, 1,000 songs in your pocket. It was sleek. It was simple. The scroll wheel was one of the most intuitive interface innovations in hardware history. And the iTunes Store that launched in 2003 gave the music industry a lifeline while giving Apple a new revenue engine. The music labels thought they were using Apple. Apple was using them.
The iPod did something that none of Apple's computers had ever done. It put an Apple product in the hands of people who didn't own a Mac. For the first time, Apple was a consumer brand, not just a computer brand. And that created a flywheel effect. People bought iPods, they fell in love with Apple's design, they started buying Macs. Apple's market share began to climb. By 2004, the iPod accounted for 40% of Apple's revenue. By 2006, it was 48%. Jobs had bet the entire company on a music player and won. But the iPod was not the endgame. It was the warm-up. Part 4. The iPhone changes everything. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and said, "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." He was not exaggerating. The original iPhone was not the most powerful smartphone on the market when it launched. It couldn't copy and paste, it didn't have 3G, it didn't have an app store. Analysts at the time were skeptical. Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, literally laughed on camera when asked about it. He said, quote, "There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance." That clip has been watched millions of times since, usually for instructional purposes. What Jobs understood, and Ballmer didn't, was that the iPhone wasn't competing on specs. It was competing on experience. The touchscreen interface was intuitive in a way no previous phone had been. The web browser actually rendered real websites. The combination of phone, music player, and internet device in a single pocket-sized object was something users immediately understood they had been waiting for. In the first weekend, Apple sold 270,000 iPhones. By the end of 2007, it had sold 1.4 million. The App Store launched in 2008, and suddenly every developer in the world was building for iPhone. The platform flywheel began to spin. The numbers that followed are staggering. Apple sold 20 million iPhones in 2008, 40 million in 2009, 93 million in 2011. By 2015, the iPhone 6 cycle alone generated more annual revenue than any other product in history. The iPhone is, by many measures, the most profitable product ever manufactured. And it came from a company that 12 years earlier had 90 days of cash left. Part 5. The financial numbers. Let's put some real numbers on this story because they're almost too big to believe. In fiscal year 1997, Apple's revenue was $7 billion and it lost $1 billion. Its market capitalization was around $3 billion, less than the company's cash on hand would be a decade later. By 2012, Apple had crossed $500 billion in market cap, the largest in the world. In 2018, it became the first U.S. company to reach $1 trillion. In 2022, it crossed $3 trillion. Apple's annual revenue in fiscal year 2025 was approximately $391 billion. The company generates more profit per year than most countries generate in GDP. It has over $160 billion in cash and investments on its balance sheet. It buys back more of its own stock each year than almost any other company in history. And none of it happens without the events of 1997, without the desperation, without Jobs coming back, without the decision to kill products and focus, without the iPod bet, without the iPhone gamble. The fall was the setup for the comeback, and the comeback was the setup for everything. Part 6. 5 Lessons from the Apple Story. Here's what the Apple story actually teaches us, and why it matters whether you're building a business, managing a career, or making investment decisions.
Lesson 1. Focus is a weapon. When Jobs came back, he didn't add products. He removed them. He cut Apple's lineup by 70%. Every successful turnaround in history involves simplification. The businesses that survive are the ones that know exactly what they are. Lesson 2. Your worst moment can be your best setup. Apple was at its lowest in 1997. Microsoft was at its peak. The conventional wisdom said Apple was finished. The people who bought Apple stock at $4 in 1997 and held it saw it grow to over $200 in split-adjusted terms, a return of over 5,000%. Lesson 3. The best deals look strange. The Microsoft investment in 1997 made no sense to Apple fans. Jobs got booed for it. But it bought Apple the time and credibility to execute the real plan. Sometimes the deal that looks like a betrayal is actually the lifeline. Lesson 4. Don't compete on price when you can compete on experience. Apple never tried to be the cheapest computer. It tried to be the best experience. That's why it can charge $1,000 for a phone when competitors charge $200. The premium is in the feeling, not the specs. Lesson 5. Execution beats vision. Jobs had visionary ideas, but so did 100 other founders. What made Apple different was the obsessive, relentless focus on execution, the details, the packaging, the the retail store experience, the way every product worked together. Vision without execution is just a hallucination. Call to action. If you got something out of this video, here's what I want you to do. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We put out new content every week covering real business stories and personal finance strategies that are backed by data. And if this story sparks something for you, if you're thinking about building something, investing in something, or just understanding the world of business better, the best time to start learning is now. The most valuable companies in the world were once counted out. Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy. That's the reminder. You don't have to be first. You don't have to be biggest. You just have to survive long enough to make the right moves. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.